Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's Going to Be All Right. My name is Niklas Minterovic,
And I'm Clayton Gwen.
and today we're going to talk about multiple intelligences.
This is true, and not paranoid schizophrenia or split personalities.
No, it's not. We're not going to talk about schizophrenia, but you've been talking about this multiple intelligences test for quite a while, and I think we've been talking about it in a couple of podcasts before, kind of mentioning it. So maybe you could tell a little bit about it.
Yeah, so this is an idea I'd been presented with well over a decade ago at this point. Maybe I'll preface with why I thought we should discuss it. From what we've been told at NMBU, the university is expected to have a hybrid learning approach, I guess you could call it that, hybrid learning, for the autumn semester. And this is probably going to happen in many places around the world as well due to the coronavirus. Slow openings, we're still dealing with restrictions. So there's been quite a lot of demand from students to get better access to things like learning techniques and study skills and time management and motivation and all sorts of things like that, because we're going to expect to continue working digitally, and we maybe aren't going to be in the classroom nearly as much. So
No.
that really kind of led me to this idea of multiple intelligences, which is something I've been working with for a long time. Long story short, the idea of multiple intelligence sort of comes out of learning, pedagogy, and psychology and was developed by Howard Gardner in 1983. And this, there's quite a lot going on at that time. There were, I think, was his name Carl Jung, was also writing on some things. These ideas had been developing since, I guess, the early mid 1900s, kind of coming up to something that it's still today a lot of people within pedagogy and learning psychology really focus on, which is this idea of multiple intelligences. And basically it's a theory that each individual has very unique and idiosyncratic preferences for how we learn best. And it suggests as a theory that intelligence isn't this sort of like centralized phenomena, but intelligence is actually something that is spread across maybe what you could call multiple nodes, meaning that basically people have multiple strengths in certain areas, and there tends to be quite a lot of cognitive overlap in these intelligences. And that's quite a departure from what for a long time in the Western world had been the standard of intelligence testing, which is the IQ test.
Standard IQ test, which measures how much of a logical thinker you are, I guess.
More or less. And well, you'd been saying you'd done a lot of sort of like IQ training and trying to improve your scores. Was it the Mensa scores or something like that?
Yeah, what I did was it all came out of this idea that I couldn't. I think someone told me that you cannot improve your IQ. Like you're born with a certain amount, and that's just how it is. And I was like, yeah, but this seems like a language to me. This seems like something that I can learn, patterns that I can recognize. So I tried to do. I think I took maybe 3 or 4 different tests each day for like a month straight, and it was IQ tests that I could find on the different Mensa homepages around the world. So I tried to simulate it as good as I could. And I improved a lot. And then I think I took a month off, just quit cold turkey on the IQ tests. And then I waited for like 4 weeks and I took another one. And my score was almost as high as when I went cold turkey. So
Yeah.
it's not like I became more intelligent. I just think that I learned how to recognize the different patterns that these tests use.
Exactly. And so I did a little bit of research coming up to this, not a huge amount because we've both been quite busy it's the end of the semester. We're trying to come up with a bunch of stuff to help people with their exams. So hopefully if you're listening to this episode, you might kind of pull out some ways to improve study techniques for yourself. But really, you said it right, that the IQ was designed more or less to sort of measure a very specific type of intelligence that was needed at the time that it was developed. Now, I might be wrong. This is just off of a quick breeze over read, but I'm pretty sure that the IQ test sort of developed out of one of the World War periods where they needed a very systematic structure to more or less separate people into who could work as engineers for the war effort, who could work as a strategist. And the IQ from there became a test that was more or less taken as like your overall intelligence. And many people believed that for a long time, despite the fact that it was really based around your ability to have a mathematical, a logical, and a rational type of intelligence, or a preference towards seeing patterns and making sense of abstractions in a logical way. And so this idea of multiple...
But not the interesting...
Go for it.
Just a small digression. It was also used as a tool to classify people or ethnicities, different cultures, or races, as they used to call them. The thing is that they would kind of compare the IQ of let's say a Western citizen with someone from Papua New Guinea or something, and then in some cases a lot of these other people would perform really bad on these IQ tests, and that's, in my opinion, because they are very culturally specific. They don't have the same vocabulary, the same way of thinking or structuring their surroundings, and that's what affects the results.
I can't remember what that was called, but it had been a huge part of psychology and pedagogy. There is a scientific term, and of course it's been discredited, where they used to, like check people's heads, and this idea that you could assess somebody's
the head.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of these things kind of got tied up into a very narrow focus on how people learn and how people express intelligence. And the IQ test was really designed to overemphasize people who had a preference towards mathematics, more or less.
Yeah, the hard sciences, basically.
Yeah. So this idea of a multiple intelligence theory, as Gardner had developed it, really started to tear that idea apart and say, but people can learn and express intelligences in many different ways that are just as equally important as the mathematical IQ test. And so this was back in 1983, and he had presented 8 independent ways that people process information. And basically, you could think of it as people have intelligences not in one particular area, but across multiple, where you'll tend to have strengths across 2 or 3 or 4 of these, but you will actually have intelligence in all of them, just a preference towards certain ones. So we could start with
and just a quick little one. I can take it later, because it's probably a good place to slip it in. Just like a story about a very specific type of intelligence, but we can save it.
Okay. That sounds good. Save the stories. Well, let's get through the boring stuff first. I'll read through my list of show notes. So we have the verbal linguistic intelligence, also known as being word smart. So if you like playing games like Scrabble or crosswords, you probably have a strength there. Logical mathematical intelligence, or logic smart. This is more in line with the traditional IQ test and people who excel in mathematics, particularly people who really enjoy more abstract mathematics. So if you like quantum physics and things like that, and we talk about that a little bit in the show, how I'm always watching.
It comes up all the time.
All the time, yeah. So I dabble a little bit in there. I wouldn't say I'm very strong at it, but I like it.
I love it. I love it. Not good at it, but I love it.
Here's one that you're probably more in line with that might have come up when you were looking over all of this, the visual-spatial intelligence, or being picture smart. Yeah, because you're always doodling stuff.
I'm always doodling stuff, and that is something that I do as a part of my process sometimes. It makes it easier for me to remember things, to process information, and now it's story time, because this is all about also recognizing colors and stuff like that, and be able to compare different shades and shapes. And when I worked as an artist, my boss, he was relatively famous artist, if I can say that. It's very un-Norwegian of me to say something like this, but
You're breaking janteloven.
yes, but he's famous in Norway, and he could sometimes, like, let's say that he was looking at a picture, a photograph, and he wanted to paint that photograph, or he wanted to take certain elements from that photograph into a painting, and he could just recognize by looking at the painting what color the different things was. So this is a lot more complicated than it sounds like, because it's not like just recognizing that a tree has green leaves. The thing is that if it's at night, these leaves might be a completely different color.
Yeah, it's
might be
different,
blue, purple,
different tones and different shades.
And he could just do that so easily. He could just pick. He saw the color for what it is, so he could kind of detach his experience of the color from the symbol, the object that you kind of used to. You're used to the idea that a certain object has a certain color. So that's why, kids, they do it very much like. You could almost say stylistical when you make a drawing. Like the sky is blue, the water is blue, the tree is brown with green leaves, but in reality the tree might be gray with yellow leaves, and then the ocean might be black because of the light. So he was very good at seeing what color something actually was.
Yeah, and that fine attention to detail, that's usually where people excel. And so we'll get to how you can figure out how you can excel in some of these a little bit later. But I think that's the key point, is to recognize that these aren't just incredibly, in a way they're rather general, but you'll notice your strengths by how much detail you can put into some of these intelligences. And how it's, as you've said, part of a process. So, for example, one of the next intelligences is the auditory musical, or sort of being musically smart or rhythmically smart. And I'm a type of person who, especially in a shared office space, like right now I share the office with my wife, and she has a lot of Skype meetings. So I'll just put on a set of headphones and just listen to music. And that kind of gives me a way to focus out of things onto what it is I'm reading or working with at the time. And kind of the rhythm of the music, sometimes the intensity of the music, can be very useful to help my motivation. So I always kind of joke around with people that putting on instrumental metal music early in the morning is like really good for me, because it's like a good cup of coffee. It just puts my brain into, like, high gear, let's get going and get working.
Gives you like an energy kick in the morning. I mean, different music can work for different tasks. Because I can also enjoy music when I work, but it depends on what I'm doing. So if I have to do something where I have to think a lot, then I like to listen to almost like instrumental, relatively quiet electronic music. Maybe something that is a little bit drony, that doesn't take my attention too much. It's more like just soundscaping in the background.
Almost more meditative.
Exactly. But if I, let's say that I'm doing something it's more about just organizing something, then I can listen to whatever. And then it might be nice to listen to something a little bit more fast-paced, so it gets more interesting.
Yeah, and the right tool for the right job. I can't listen to music with lyrics in it when I'm reading, because I get distracted. But, I can listen to music with lyrics in it when I'm just doing kind of odd jobs, categorizing things that don't require so much attention to that detail.
So when I'm writing, that's when I want to listen to something where there's no lyrics, because I do the same thing. Like, I think about something and I try to formulate it in my mind first, and then I'm listening to the lyrics at the same time, and it just doesn't work.
So I've got a feeling, because we've both taken some multiple intelligence tests and we'll reveal the results, but I've got a feeling like because we've been sitting here talking about auditory musical, we probably both scored quite highly in that regard.
We
so
did.
let's get through the other 4 of these and then we can go into these really good details of how your multiple intelligences can be useful for you in your day-to-day work and study environment. Okay, so let's recap. We've had the verbal linguistic, the logical mathematical, the visual spatial, the auditory musical. Now there's the bodily kinesthetic or body smart. So that's typically athletes. Those would be people who are incredibly intelligent in their bodily kinesthetic, but also, as we would say, people who kind of learn hands-on, that they need to work with something and manipulate it with their hands.
Almost like a tinker kind of. Yeah.
You got to take something apart yourself to see how it works and put it back together to understand. So maybe if you're one of those people, or a fidgeter, even if you're someone who can't sit still.
Classic inventor.
Yeah. You can say
that type of person.
And so this is quite broad too, because it could be, your entire body and your ability to do something, incredibly complex and choreographed like ballet or hockey, gymnastics, all the way down to, these much finer motor skills of tinkering or say watchmaking or something like that.
Which is very, it's very close to drawing or painting or something like that.
Exactly. So these intelligences do overlap, that very much so, someone who's also bodily kinesthetic smart may also find that, they fall into the auditory musical category if you play an instrument, for example. And then we come to sort of like people smarts. And there's 2 types here. There is the interpersonal people intelligence, and then there is the intrapersonal. So the interpersonal being that you're quite aware and cognizant of the goings on of the social group around you. Maybe these are the people who are quite empathetic, people who work best in groups, people who are, the team player. And then the intrapersonal is people who are more self-intelligent, that they're more aware of their own feelings, their own thoughts, their own understandings, their own processes. Maybe more of the loner, someone who prefers to work individually. They don't require so much communication with other people to work their ideas out. And then finally, we come down to the naturalistic or the nature smart. And so, for instance, I'll give you story time. Spent this weekend up in Hemsedal for some backcountry skiing. And if you're ever out, anybody who's ever out in the mountain knows you need to be aware of what's going on in your surroundings. You're watching the weather, you're paying attention to wind direction and wind strength, you're paying attention in the springtime to how the sun is affecting the snow and
because of avalanches
and also where's there going to be not just safe skiing, but good snow conditions. So looking at how the snow forms, where is it wind affected, and what types of formations are being pushed into the snow to create a better sense of where should I go up, but also where can I come down. So you might find that people who kind of are, much more outdoorsy or are into botany or biology, they probably fall a little bit more under the naturalistic. So now we've already taken a test, and we'll share some of these tests in the show notes. And the idea is that these multiple intelligences can be used to help you create a better work and study and learning environment for yourself by identifying where your strengths are and trying to create, study and work processes that fit under that type of intelligence that you have strength in. But we've already taken the test, so we could spoil the results. But before you took the test, Niklas, what would you have sort of labeled yourself as? Where across these 8 would you see that you have a lot of strengths?
We've been talking a lot about music, and that's something that I'm very interested in. Rhythms, lyrics, singing, just recognizing different sounds. So that's something that I was pretty sure that I would get a pretty high score in that category. And then the same thing with the spatial? No.
The visual
Yeah?
spatial, yeah.
Exactly. That one, because I enjoy drawing. I'm very interested in art. I'm very visually oriented when it comes to my surroundings. That one I was pretty sure that I would see come up. And the same went for the naturalist, because I enjoy being outside. And I'm very interested in nature. But I also we talked about this many times, that I'm very interested in climbing, and I to a certain extent consider myself to be an athlete. So and I try to get out and climb as much as possible. So I would think that the bodily kinesthetic intelligence would be present. When it comes to how good I am with people, I don't know. That's always a difficult thing, right? Seeing yourself in relation to other people.
Yeah, without coming off sounding incredibly arrogant.
Yeah, I'm great with people. Yeah, I don't know, but so I was a little bit more unsure about the two last ones, and the mathematical one, the logical one. I don't enjoy doing math, not because I find it to be very interesting, but I'm just not very good at it. So yeah. And what about you? What was your thoughts? I mean, you've probably taken tests like this.
Yeah, I've been taking these tests on myself for years and years, but they do really kind of reinforce that, I would say if I had to pick out of all of these 8, which one my top one would be, that would be very difficult because there's so much overlap sometimes. I definitely enjoy word puzzles and reading, and a big part of my PhD is sort of looking into the definitions of how how a process is interpreted differently in different situations, and how that kind of impacts policies and practices. So to some regard, I would definitely say that I have a strength there. I've always liked math and logic problems and solving certain types of puzzles and things like that. And I found I've kind of been quite naturally good at it. I think it's just the patterns tend to make quite a bit of sense, but I decided not to actually pursue a career in mathematics, but that probably explains why I spend so much time listening to Star Talk Radio and PBS Space Time and stuff, because I still like learning about that stuff, even though I don't work on it a whole lot.
Because as we started this podcast with, I really enjoyed these different intelligence tests, like IQ tests, and that's puzzles. And I also enjoy board games a lot. That's a hobby of mine. Different kinds of types of strategic board games, and that falls into that category, I think.
Yeah. And that is exactly it, that, sometimes the visual spatial, for example, solving a picture puzzle or a Rubik's Cube, it's not just a mathematical formula that you can follow. You also need to kind of visually understand how the moves work and that sort of thing. And you could see that something like the visual spatial would overlap very nicely with the naturalistic. If you want to go and understand and study things in nature, you probably pay very careful attention to how these things look and where they appear in their environment.
I just came to think about it. The people that are into hip hop and rap and freestyle rapping. Mm-hmm. Then you got a combination between rhythm and music, but also poetry and wordplay.
Mm-hmm. The verbal linguistic.
So there we also have another. Exactly.
And also,
so there we also have a combination.
Totally. And then a lot of that also comes down to your bodily kinesthetic ability to keep, not just, have this sort of innate cognitive sense of rhythm, but a physical ability, your own body smarts to be able to control all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. So the idea really behind these isn't that one stands by itself. And it might be better to think of multiple intelligence as kind of indicating how people best process information when presented to them. And so that's also going to depend on the type of information that is being presented. If you're sitting in a classroom listening to a lecture, and the lecture is in, the science or the philosophy of science and causality, you have to, for you to be able to process that information effectively, it's really good if you have strengths in the auditory side, in the verbal linguistic side, and also the logical mathematical side, because a lecture is auditory, it's oral, it's spoken. It's about words, and the logical mathematical is more about abstract ideas. You're not necessarily getting a visual representation. You're not necessarily moving a lot, so you're not learning this stuff by doing. You're definitely not talking with other people or necessarily talking with yourself, and you're not sitting outside in nature. So a lot of this also comes down to when people say, oh, I'm just not smart. I don't understand this stuff. I don't think it has anything to do with the subject matter as much as the way that subject matter is presented to you. And I think that that's a really important thing for any learner or anybody who is, anybody at all, really, to recognize that it's probably the way the information is presented to you, not the information itself. And that's where this multiple intelligences theory can be so powerful, because if you do have an interest in the subject, it's just a matter of figuring out what is my preference for how that information can be presented to me. And then you can go and find that type of information presentation style somewhere else in a way that is going to help you internalize it and learn about it in a more meaningful way.
And a lot of these, just taking a test like this, will also give you like, okay, I'm good with colors or shapes, so then I could use that to my advantage when I take notes or when I try to categorize information. I can make mind maps. I could use different colors, or as I think we talked about this in another episode, because we talked about our show notes and we compared your show notes to my show notes, and you said something like that you include exclamation points and stuff like that. So, and that probably has to do, I think I said something along the lines of that I like to inject what I write with emotion, because that makes it easier for me to remember. So I kind of almost turning it into a drama.
Yeah.
So that
using
helps for
your
me.
word smarts. Yeah, your word smarts and your self smart. Because when you're making show notes or taking any kind of note, that is dealing with the interpersonal intelligence. How are you sort of leaving a breadcrumb trail that's going to make sense for you? So yeah, I mean, the show notes are a great example of that, because yeah, mine are just more or less like a list, series of bullet points, brief little bits. I usually include sources to other things so that I can just pull up an article and give you more specific information as need be. And I mean, yeah, I don't need to use a lot of punctuation, because maybe it's just that I'm a little bit better at doing that in the moment instead of needing to infuse my notes with that. But that's just also how I am.
I think it's I mean, people have different preferences on how they kind of find it easy to remember stuff, or so to me, just I don't know, just making it into a story, injecting some emotion in it, just makes it easier for me to remember. And then it kind of includes the amount of information that I find necessary. But it can vary a lot, so it depends on what I'm doing. Sometimes I've never been the guy to color code stuff too much. I know that some people really like that with post-its, or just change the color of the writing, or use different pens and stuff. But as you know, I'm into drawing, so I could maybe turn, like, let's say that I make a mind map, and one of the sections I would just make into a head for some reason,
Yeah.
And it might not really be connected to what it's about. It just makes it easier for me to remember.
It's like you give the thing a brain so it can begin to take form and think for itself in a way.
I just turn it into something, and I think it's all about, to me, how I think a lot in what I associate with different things. So it can be a color is can be in my head it can be connected to like one specific object or a person or a feeling. A lot of people are like that. Like blue is a feeling blue, for example, or pink is a sweet color, stuff like that. But I think all of us have a lot of symbols like that, which are very individual and unique, and I think I pay a lot of attention to them. So that's why I could make turn one part of the mind map into it could be anything. Like maybe I made a lot of different arrows that makes me think about a giraffe, so I just turn it into a giraffe.
Yeah. And I think that this is a big part of it is, so much education, especially at university, is still very much based around an old way of learning that predominantly focuses on people who excel in the logical mathematical, the verbal linguistic, and the auditory, not necessarily the musical. And what I mean by that is you attend lectures that are predominantly spoken. So we're relying on an auditory type of learning. And maybe I'm gonna hint on this as well too, that there's this also this idea of learning styles, which works very well with the theory of multiple intelligences in that there's sort of three main ways that we learn information. So I would say a multiple intelligence is sort of how people prefer information to be presented to them, for them to process, and learning style is more about how you actually process to learn and retain that information. And they're not too different. The theory, as it sort of stands in a very general way, is that there's three learning styles. There are visual learners, people who learn best by seeing. There are auditory learners, people who learn best by hearing and speaking. And there are tactile or kinesthetic learners, people who learn best through experience and kind of working hands-on. So with those sorts of things in mind, we kind of end up having visual and auditory as the main learning style at universities. And that is expressed through the intelligence of verbal linguistic, where you have to write essays, or logical mathematical, where you have to present equations or schematics or plans for something. And then the auditory, which is predominantly about listening and speaking. And in that way,
it also
lot of
depends
education,
on the discipline a little bit.
Yeah, that's true. Because
some
landscape architects,
some of them are in the lab and stuff as well.
Yes, that's true. So you do get to that degree in the research work, maybe not so much in the classroom. I guess that would be the distinction. In the area of research, you can engage in a lot of these things, but in the classroom, more specifically, where quote unquote learning is done, which obviously it's not done there. It's done every day of your life in every situation you come into.
All the time.
Yeah. So really what I'm trying to say here is that if you are struggling in these particular learning environments, it's probably because the information isn't being presented in a great way to you, which means it's not that you shouldn't go and sit in the classroom and listen to lectures or listen to online lectures. But be prepared that you're going to need to supplement this information in a way that makes a lot more sense to you. And a really great way to do that is, you can take a multiple intelligences test, and there's dozens of these scattered around the internet. And so we took some. I took three myself. Did you do?
I took I did the same tests, 3 of them. So, and I also think it's important to point out that since we and students have to work from home for some time, and let's see what happens when autumn comes around. But I think these tests are very important now because it's all about learning to be autodidactic. So these tests can kind of reveal different things about you, which will make it easier for you to find the most effective things you can do to learn. So it might be to go for a walk, it might be to train regularly or exercise, or it might be to make mind maps. It might be a lot of different things, but I think it's kind of like it can hint you towards some personal study techniques.
Exactly. And so that's where I thought for us to take a couple different tests. I wanted to do that to see what the results would be, because realistically, each test is going to ask you slightly different questions, and it'll be of different lengths, and we'll go to different depths. So by taking 3, I think it's going to give us a good idea of what is like the 1 or 2 really strong ones we have, but also how, depending on the test you take and the questions that are asked, you can get very different answers. And then we can talk about kind of how our own learning style and our own intelligence styles have kind of helped to inform our study and work processes. And then we could maybe touch on what we might think for each one of these along the way. So
I started with the one from Alberta.
I think I did that one second. But did you find that you had really consistent responses across these 3, or were they much more varied?
Relatively consistent. So there were certain things that came up in all 3 of the tests, and then some variation. Yeah.
Yeah, I've found.
But the questions were a little bit different.
Yeah.
And then it's, sometimes it's very easy to overthink tests like this. So one question could be something along the lines of, do you enjoy the company of other people? And then it's like, yeah, yes and no.
Yeah,
I guess.
Depends on the day. Not
It
today,
depends on the
but
person.
maybe tomorrow. Depends on the
Exactly.
people. So yeah.
It depends on the person, like Donald Trump or my friends. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's easy to overthink them. And the questions might be like written a little bit differently. So you kind of, the results might vary, but there are some very prominent tendencies here, I must say.
So I did
Should we
find,
just-
I did find on 2 of the tests, the first one that I took, which I think was coming from the government of Alberta, one that I found actually, strangely enough, where I'm from in Canada, the Government Career Services Center, something like that, is using this. I thought that was interesting, which is why I included it. But that one and one from literacynet.org, I got very similar scores. And then the one that we took from Personality Max, I got one of the same scores. So musical was my top score on all of them. It beat everything.
Well, in 2 of the tests, that was very prominent. But to me, it seems like it was, there were some differences. In the literacy.net one, musical, top score is 5, right? Mm-hmm. And I got 4.71. And I think you got 5.
I got 5, yeah.
Yeah. And then in the Alberta test, I got 72% of 100.
Yeah.
And then on the last one, that's from Personality Max, then it was 87%. So it was prominent.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
Yeah, so mine was from the literacy.net. It was, or literacynet.org. It was the musical scored 5 out of 5. It was 97% in the Personality Max. It was 94% with the Alberta test. But then this is where it gets a little bit weird. And it's a good idea to take several of these because you'll get some slightly different responses. For one of them, musical and bodily kinesthetic were tied. But for another one, there was a 1.4 factor difference between musical and bodily kinesthetic. And then another one I took, there was a 23% difference. And it was bodily kinesthetic was ranked 4th. It didn't even make it in my top 3.
I also had naturalists. So in the Alberta test, that was 84%.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Much better than my 50%.
And then in the Personality Max test, it was 93%. And then in the literacy.net, it didn't even show up.
There you go. My top ones then were for 2 of the 3. that we took. It was musical, intrapersonal, bodily kinesthetic. Not necessarily in that order, although musical scored the highest in all of them. And then in the third one, my top three were musical, logical, linguistic. So again, this is just to demonstrate that depending on the questions and how you interpret them, you're not going to dominate in just one. And you probably are not going to dominate and consistently have two or three. It is to show you that you have strengths in many of these. And these strengths are useful in particular situations.
And they are connected, I mean, if you're a dancer, then you're going to score a lot on like rhythm and stuff, but also on the movement, on the bodily kinesthetic one.
Yeah.
So I also got, I think, in the personality max test, that was number 3 for me, kinesthetics. And then visual after that. And then in the Alberta test, intrapersonal was actually very, very prominent, 88%. That was the highest one. But they didn't show up in any other test.
Yeah. When I look at some of these, especially like the Alberta test and the personality max, I was scoring 50% or above on everything. My lowest score was a 50% in one of them, and on the other one, my lowest score for 2 was 53%.
My lowest score was 57% in interpersonal in the personality max test.
Yeah. So I guess it really comes down to how you interpret these. Also, thinking about the context that you are working in. So we've already talked a little bit on some of these, like because I score very high in the musical and you score quite high in the musical as well, that having music while we work can be quite useful for us. I also tended to score quite high on 2 of the 3 on the intrapersonal, and I can definitely see that I work very well by myself, really reflecting on my own work. And one of the processes that I'll do is, you might have been told in university, like keep a research log or a study diary or something like that. I don't do that religiously. It's not an everyday thing. But when I am working on research or when I am coming up with ideas, I'm sort of jotting down bullet points, kind of writing down keywords or things like that for me to work with, that the next day when I come back, I look that over and I kind of think about where I had left off, and I think about where I am today and how my thoughts have changed or how my thoughts have improved. And I think that definitely links very strongly to this interpersonal type of intelligence.
Yeah, I agree. I also got a quite high score on the intrapersonal. And something else that I found interesting is the naturalist one on me. I mean, I definitely enjoy being physically active, and I think that we talked about this before, but when I was writing my master thesis, I just had to go for these walks, and that's kind of when I came up with a lot of the best ideas. Yeah. I talk to myself while I walk, or I just think, and it might be a walk in the forest or something, not too fast, but like medium tempo. Then it seems like it almost generates like thoughts in a way. It just drives my mind, and I find it really comfortable. So,
and I definitely find that as well. Taking a walk at lunch, or at 2 p.m, having a coffee break and going for a walk when mostly I just need to give my brain a break, really, or my eyes more often from staring at a screen. My brain is still working. I'm still thinking about these things, and that was also something I scored highly on in almost all of them, was the bodily kinesthetic. And
yeah, I also scored quite high in every test.
Yeah, so when it's related to education, maybe going and doing some physical activity during part of your workday could be good for you. Or also,
I think I told you this before, but when we were working at campus, I was like working out in the office every morning. I had like a workout routine. Yeah. And I also went into this, there's like a room that you showed me, the massage room.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some
the
weights
hidden
and stuff.
secret.
Exactly, and a TRX and some stuff. So I would usually, like, if I weren't able to do it in the morning before the other people arrived, I would just do it after lunch or something. Just a quick little workout session every day. And I also think that if I'm working on something that requires a lot of focus and I have to sit and write for hours and hours and hours, it's extremely important for me to, I'm into climbing, so I just have to go climb. And it just makes me more effective. This is a story that I told before, but I think it was he was like the what do you call it? The chief, the leader of Rikshospitalet, the main hospital in Oslo.
The big
he
boss.
He was playing tennis.
Yeah.
The big boss. Yeah, that's what it's called. The emperor of the
Supreme overlord of Rikshospitalet.
Of the hospital. He was and he was playing tennis in the morning, and then it got really stressful at work, so he just, okay, I don't got time to play tennis now. But he soon realized that he just had to play because it made him so much more effective, that he was just losing time if he didn't play tennis, even though it took 50 minutes out of his day every morning. So I think I'm similar. I have a lot of physical energy that I need to get out.
Yeah, and that can be really good if you can use it linked to what it is you're trying to learn or what it is that you're studying. But also another way that you could think about it, because you climb, and I used to, when I was in university in Canada, worked at a recreational center as a lifeguard, and we had a climbing wall, so I'd go and spend time getting to know the people there and learn to climb myself a little bit. But what I thought was really interesting about that environment is how well people knew their own physical limitations and their own styles. That you look at the same route, you look at the same problem, and different people will figure out different areas that are the most difficult based off of their own technique and their own approach. That there's
and their body. Like
exactly.
If you're short, tall, long arms, short arms, if you're flexible, there's so many climbing like problems or lines out there that require completely different movement depending on your on your body. But then you have like your personal strengths as well. So some people have strong fingers, so they can do a move a certain way, but other people might have extremely flexible hips, so they could kind of get their feet really high and make the move easier with using that kind of technique. So and then you have the, like, if you're trying to do a climb, it's all about learning all the moves and then putting them together and then trying to do it all in a sequence. And that's kind of like dancing, like knowing all the different moves that you have to do.
Yeah, and it's in a way, it's sort of a form of problem solving as well.
Yeah, like a puzzle.
Yeah. So again, these things, they overlap in so many different ways that it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you're not book smart, you don't have other types of intelligences and ways of looking at things and solving problems that are presented to you. But more in line with what the podcast is really about in the environment that we work at, which is, about learning and communicating and researching. Why don't we just talk about some of the different ideas that we think, based off of each of these intelligences, would be good study techniques or good motivation techniques or good work habits that you could get into as we have to continue studying and working in isolation?
Well, we could just start out with the bodily and kinesthetic one, because we just talked about it. I mean, if that's something that you're naturally good at, it's something that you should do. So it doesn't really have to be an active part of your learning, but it could be, it could be, but it could also be just being able to exercise every day will probably have a really good effect on your ability to focus.
And I would definitely say figure out if you are a morning person or a night owl, and fit some exercise or training or at least some physical activity into a point in the day that works well for you. And if you're not so into training, but you do tend to score within the bodily kinesthetic, it could be a good idea to start doing walks instead of sitting and having a coffee break. Take a 20-minute walk around your neighborhood and think over your problems. Think over the things that you have been
Or just
reading.
or just a bike ride or something.
Totally. Yeah.
If you're into that, or cruising around on a skateboard or whatever, just being outside, preferably getting some fresh air and some movement.
Yeah. And make it a routine, you know. Even, one thing that I do when it comes to the bodily kinesthetic is after years of skateboarding and years of snowboarding, my lower back and my hips and my knees and my ankle are pretty sore most days. So I will just actually take my laptop, the joys of working from home, and sit on the floor and do several core stretches to help loosen everything up while I sit and read or sit and write. And that's something easily that helps to engage me in my getting my body to feel a little bit more comfortable so that I can even sit in a chair and work productively for the rest of the day.
I'm not doing it every day, but every other day, I think. I would just remove my chair and sit on a Pilates ball instead.
Or stand.
That helps a lot.
Yeah.
Or stand, but I don't really have the opportunity. I could stand in the kitchen, I think, but the internet connection is so bad in the kitchen.
Oh, yeah.
So, it's difficult to work from the kitchen. But I usually sit on this Pilates ball. That's a good one. And just walk around the house a little bit, turn on some music, dance a little bit, just keep moving and making changes. That's important for me because I'm really good at focusing, but I need to break. I need to, in order to focus, I need to be calm. And if I feel like my body is full of physical energy, then it's difficult for me to focus, like a child.
So how about for the verbal linguistic? Is there any process or practice that you think is worth pursuing?
It depends, but if you can easily remember lyrics, then you might want to turn things that you find that you have to learn. It could be an equation. You could make it into like a rhyme or a poem or something.
Rhyming.
That's
study
one
notes.
way of remembering things.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people do that, or you could just listen to music at the same time and associate a certain topic with one specific song. That's a possibility.
Yeah. I would definitely say, take notes, write things down, read, look over your own study notes, go back and read course material or find other material on the same topic that is at least presented, linguistically in a way that makes sense for you. And we talk a lot about that on the podcast, what with it mostly being a writing-focused podcast, finding material that is actually easy for you to read and understand.
And also try to explain it to other people. Like because that's also an extremely strong learning tool. Like there's nothing that there's so much good learning in as to teach other people.
And I think that
and if you have a strong vocabulary, then it's probably something that you enjoy.
Yes, and that connects very nicely with the auditory and interpersonal. So speaking with other people, talking with them, getting their input, trying to teach people yourself about what it is that you have learned is a great way to sort of hit on all three of these. So I think
also try to explain it to other people that might have a completely different approach than you. I mean,
exactly. Talk to your
mechanic. You might want to explain some exactly, and he has a completely different process. If you want to explain something to him, let's say it could be a theory from social anthropology or something. Then maybe you want to use car parts as an analogy.
Exactly.
Because that's something that he's familiar with and how they fit together.
What about for logical, mathematical people?
I think I read something about using numbers for different purposes, so you could make small riddles for yourself or different numerical patterns. Categorizing things.
Categorize, yeah. Make categories of things in any number of ways. And a category is, of course, going to link with any of these other types of intelligences. So you could categorize with color. And that falls maybe more under if you have a strength in the visual spatial. You could categorize with a mind map which would also fall under that sort of visual spatial. You could do like I do, which is
But there are
categorize kind of by
combinations
lists.
here, right?
Yeah. So there's no shortage of ways that you can categorize that are going to touch on some of these other intelligences, but you're probably using them, using these other intelligences to support the logical mathematical side that you might prefer. And definitely I would say if you're very logical mathematical, it's good to create systems. It's good to create routines. It's probably good to work with a timer and keep yourself regimented because the numbers kind of help in that way, I would say.
Because some people like that, and they're very much aware of how much time has passed. But a person like me, I know that I do my best when I find something to be so interesting that I lose track of time. So that's kind of something that I try to... I want that to happen. I want to kind of space out, to zone into something so hard that I lose track of time. That's when I learn the best, because then I have the passion. And a way to do that is to include stuff that I like and I find to be interesting. So that would be, we talked about this earlier, but I really enjoy making lists. But I kind of combine that with drawings in a way, making different symbols and shapes. That's a good way for me to organize stuff and remember it.
That kind of categorization, I think, falls nicely under, again, things like the Visualspatial. For example, another thing that I would come up with if you're more of a Visualspatial learner would be you might actually enjoy doing your readings where there are a lot of results that are visualized, where there are conceptual and theoretical frameworks. Yeah, in ways where it's easier for you to see the patterns within them. So,
and also with the naturalistic intelligence, you could go there, right, on an excursion or something, and just experience. It could be anything, right? But imagine being in like a hot air balloon over the Amazon or something. Have you seen that when they use these kind of like, it's almost like a hot air balloon, but they collect stuff from the trees, like birds and insects.
No, I've never.
Have you seen it?
No,
like
I've
a
never seen
giant
that.
net. No, it looks so cool.
Bird
I've seen
fishing.
it in almost. I've seen it in like it's almost like a hot air balloon, and underneath it there's like a giant net that you can sit in.
Interesting.
And then you can collect things from the top of these super tall trees. Oh. So that's something that I always wanted to do.
Which is weird because you're really a climber. I thought you'd want to climb the tree instead.
Yeah, I mean, I would also like to climb the tree, but there's something about floating over this ocean of green, that just looks so cool. And you can access the top of these trees that are super tall, and they find... You know how it is with Amazon. They find new species all the time.
Oh, yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of these species disappear as well. But I don't want to talk about that because it's very depressing.
And maybe for a different podcast.
Yeah.
So one thing, especially for the Visualspatial, aside from things like color coding or, looking for some sorts of patterns or drawing, visualization techniques as well. When you're faced with a problem, could you kind of abstract it and take it to a different context? Or, this is something that's really good if you suffer from maybe some type of anxiety as well. If you're more of a Visualspatial kind of person, can you visualize yourself in a much calmer environment? And that could be very useful.
Before a presentation or something?
Or before an exam, anything
before
like that.
Before the oral exams.
Yeah, exactly. So that's also something good that you might be able to use. Definitely.
And another thing, just the visualization process. That's something that I do all the time with climbing. So I could be at home at night or something, and I could think about the moves and trying to connect them together, and I could see myself completing a climb that I want to do. But you could do the same thing with the presentation. I mean, if you're going to have a presentation in a couple of days, you could go through it in your head. You could see yourself doing the lecture, pointing at the slides on the screen, different things. And that helps a lot. It helps with kind of when to do what. Okay, maybe I should talk about that first, and then I want to point to the slide, and then I want to ask the audience, and then I want to wait a little bit, and it's that visualization process is very beneficial to me, at least.
And so I think that this idea of like visualizing is a really cool idea. But I also had, as we were talking about this, I'm visualizing some other techniques that I remember some students coming in when I was working at the writing center on a daily basis, and some of them would just put their phone out. And I was thinking, okay, like that's a bit weird. What are they doing? And then I realized after a while that they were actually recording the conversation. So this is more for the auditory people. It's not a visual thing. It's just I was thinking and visualizing that at the time. But if you're more of an auditory learner, and maybe instead of writing down notes in the classroom, you should be recording the classroom lectures and listening back in your own time in a place where you feel comfortable and there's less anxiousness, or there's less stress of the environment. So
and some people also really like to make abbreviations of things, and they remember things easily by I mean, we've been talking about paragraph structure, and we use this system we called SEEC structure. So SEEC, I mean, obviously stands for something. The thing is that some people, they can just easily remember stuff if they make different kinds of abbreviations. That's never been my approach. Sometimes, especially in pedagogy, there's so many different, this is a good technique for, it could be for how to structure, like, let's say you want to teach someone something, and then you want to include all these different kind of approaches, and that could be made into an abbreviation. And some people really like that, and just can easily remember and structure their thinking according to that.
Yeah. So I guess the takeaway from all of this is that, there's kind of more than one way to skin a cat, as you could say. Not all of these techniques or approaches are going to be great for you, and they are just that. They're techniques and approaches, and there's many, many more that you can find. So realistically, and this is something I've been doing in lectures, in the classroom, in the writing center for years now, is helping people really come to understand where their strengths lie, in how they prefer information to be presented to them, and how they prefer to process that information. And then figure out, based off of those intelligences that you have in the strong areas, what are the techniques and approaches that you can apply in your everyday study and work routine that is going to help you to be motivated and to learn and retain this information and communicate it. And
just another thing, because you can get better at these different intelligences if you want to. And sometimes, let's say that you're a student, and to be able to learn as effectively as possible, you need to apply certain strategies, and that might make you better at. It could be the logical, or it could be the musical, or the kinesthetic. It totally depends. But like, if you study something where you spend a lot of time in the lab or constructing different things, maybe you're not really used to that, and that's not your strong side, but you will apply your different intelligences to be able to complete the different tasks that you have to do. And then you will get better at that eventually.
Exactly. I think
and you will have your own interesting take on it.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, that you can get better at these if you realize that you have a weakness that you want to strengthen. Think about how the areas you're already strong in give you a really good foundation for, say, for example, if you want to become more people smart, what are the types of environments and approaches and techniques that could be useful to maybe make you a better, team player in a group project? What are the ways that you work? What are the ways that other people work? And find, perhaps maybe the easiest way for us to work together as a group of people is we're all very strong in the verbal linguistic. So why don't we, instead of meeting in person, communicate in a group chat, for example? Maybe that is a good way to do it. Or maybe not.
I've also seen that there's a lot of people that are, maybe not, but I've also seen that a lot of athletes, it might be people that they might not be that interested in math, but because they are professional athletes, they're suddenly getting more interested in physics. Just how much leverage can your arm take in a certain position. And then it's all about training, maximizing your training and nutrition and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because you might not think that athletes would really care about something like statistics, but perhaps they really do, because
They really do.
Because, it's just a matter of how that information is being presented. So yeah, for people who struggle with statistics, maybe it's not the statistics that are the problem. It's that
It's the arena.
you're not trying to work with statistics in something that you're genuinely interested in. So if you like sports, look at sports stats. You probably are using statistics on a regular basis to follow your favorite team and not even realize that you're engaging with that type of mathematics.
And I mean, they try to quantify their performance in order to maximize it, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so how can I get better? How can I monitor my performance as best as possible? And then you have to break it down to small parts, and then nutrition will be a part of it, and just different types of exercises that you do that will make you strong in various ways. But I think the point is that this applies to everything. I mean, if you are a very visually oriented person and you really want to learn math, or you have to learn math because the study program you're in, then there are ways that you could kind of use the intelligences that you're already strong in to get better at something else.
Exactly.
So just with me and the different IQ tests, I think that was more about like my, how can I say this, my ability to recognize patterns in things. Because that is something that to me is closely resembled to drawing and shapes and how shapes might be similar. And to me, a lot of these IQ tests revolve around, that type of puzzles. So that was kind of my way in to get better at that type of like logical, what do you call it? Like a logical little riddle, almost.
So I guess the whole point of this is, if we have to expect that, especially in a university environment, learning is going to become much more self-directed. One upside I do see is that by needing to use digital teaching and putting more things online, and hopefully adding additional, hyperlinks and resources that students can end up using, we might actually see the traditional classroom learning environment break down, and people will more easily be able to engage in the types of multiple intelligences that they have and find information and approaches to learning outside of the classroom that work better for them. So
and possibly different use of different kinds of visuals, videos, things you can interact with, creating games that will give this much more of a hands-on experience with it could be solving different problems. I mean, I remember this, they made a computer game, or someone made a computer game. I think it was like a team of scientists, and it was all about creating new like proteins and stuff. And they made it into a game. So, and then they would just save all the different results. So in a way, they kind of crowdfunded the invention of new proteins.
interesting.
It is.
I hadn't heard
it's kind
about
of cool.
that. Yeah.
So, and there are many games like that, that kind of just attacks a problem from a completely different angle. And then you will get people that are really strong at other types of intelligences that might be able to solve problems that, in a different field, because they come from a completely different angle, a new perspective on something.
Yeah, that almost that science game you were talking about kind of reminded me in a different way of Ender's Game, for anybody who might be familiar with that, just with less terrible ramifications.
yeah. But I think that's when it comes to solving problems. Sometimes you need to come from a completely different angle to be able to solve the problem. You need to think outside the box, and that's when I think mapping out these different intelligences can be really beneficial, because it shows your strengths and how you could potentially solve problems that are outside your field of competence.
And so for anybody who's interested in taking any of these tests, I will link them in the show description, but otherwise you can just use an internet search, multiple intelligences test.
There's a bunch of them.
Yeah, try to figure some of this stuff out. There's a lot of really great and very accessible resources as well that kind of link these intelligences to ways that you can learn, or ways that you can manage your time, or ways that you can rely on multiple of your intelligences to do things like problem solving. So I'm kind of hoping that this gives you a little bit of insight into your own processes, and especially if you have been faced with boredom or losing your motivation after so many months of home office and digital learning and digital classrooms and things like that. Here's something to maybe spice your life up a little.
Another thing, for everybody who will score or will have we'll see that the bodily kinesthetic thing shows up quite a lot in these tests, like me, then it's probably beneficial for you to write some of your notes by hand, because this is all about the thing is that your brain will react differently when you write something compared to using your keyboard. So if you are very much focused on what your body physically can do and will do, then that might be a good approach.
So Nicholas, do you think it's safe to say that for the upcoming months, and students and professors even and researchers for the upcoming semester in the fall, if they arm themselves with this sort of stuff, it's going to be all right?
That's correct. It's going to be all right.
All right, Nicholas, thanks for another great episode. We'll see everybody next week.
See you next week. See you next week. See you next week. See you next week.